Hello, good evening, and welcome to Scotland at 7 here at Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Donald C. Stewart, and I am delighted this evening to be joined with a real person actually in the studio. We have Martyn Day, MP for Linlithgow and East Falkirk. Martyn, delighted to have you with us, and welcome to the programme.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. Westminster is on its medieval agricultural festival break, which means I get let out for good behaviour, so it's really good to be here in person rather than try to shout down a very dodgy Wi-Fi line.
Indeed, and dodgy Wi-Fi lines are something they know very well at Westminster. However, this evening we are going to have our usual array of things that you may not be hearing about in the mainstream media, including a number of attacks, including real ones on devolution, the deposit return scheme, data, Kosovo, Rohingya, and on poverty, as well as faux attacks, which are all to do with privacy and WhatsApp messaging. However, we begin, as we always do, with the Ukrainian update on day 461 of the real attack on the democratic government within Ukraine by the Russians. And Moscow has been targeted with a large-scale drone attack for the first time in its 15-month-old war in Ukraine, marking a new inflection point in a conflict that the Kremlin said would never threaten the lives of ordinary Russians. The Russian Defence Ministry said 8 drones targeted the city overnight. 2 people were injured in the attack, according to Moscow Mayor Sergei Sobyanin, and the buildings sustained minor damage. Russia blamed Kyiv for the attack. Ukrainian presidential aide Mikhailo Podolyak denied Ukraine was involved, but said he predicted an increase in the number of attacks. Russia continues to assault Ukraine with deadly missile and drone strikes on a near-daily basis. Ukraine's capital, Kyiv, faced its third air raid in 24 hours on Tuesday morning. Kyiv's mayor, Vitaly Klitschko, has confirmed that 20 residents were evacuated from a damaged building and that 1 person died, 4 were injured. Suspiln, Ukraine's state broadcaster, reports that in the last 24 hours the Russian army shelled 8 cities and towns of the Donetsk region. It states that a total of 26 civilian objects were damaged, 10 people were injured and 2 people died. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said yesterday that using the US-provided Patriot anti-missile systems ensured a 100% interception rate and would play a role in pushing forward against Russia's invasion. The advisor to the head of the office of Ukraine's President, Mikhailo Podolyak, has suggested that any peace settlement acceptable to Ukraine would include a demilitarised zone extending between 100 kilometres and 120 kilometres into Russia. He said that the key topic of the post-war settlement should be the establishment of safeguards to prevent a recurrence of aggression in the future. 2 people were killed and 8 were wounded in a Russian attack on the city of Toretsk yesterday morning. Pavlo Kirilenko, the governor of the Donetsk region, has said. Kirilenko said Russian forces had used high-explosive aerial bombs in the attack at about 11:30 a.m. local time, which damaged a gas station and a multi-storey building in the city. And Polish President Andrzej Duda said that he would sign a bill to allow a panel to investigate whether the opposition party, Civic Platform, allowed the country to be unduly influenced by Russia and as a result became too dependent on its fuel when it was in power. The opposition party Civic Platform rejects the claims and says the law is designed to destroy support for the party in the lead up to the elections which are being held at the end of the year. In further international news, the Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen said that her government planned to increase spending on military aid to Ukraine by $2.6 billion over this year and next. Earlier this year, Denmark set up a $1 billion fund for military, civilian and business aid to Ukraine. Danmarks Radio, the Danish public service broadcaster, reported that the new funds were earmarked for military aid. Ukraine's parliament has passed a bill that sanctions Iran for 50 years. The bill was put forward by Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. The bill will stop Iranian goods transiting through Ukraine and ban use of its airspace, as well as imposing trade, financial and technology sanctions against Iran and its citizens. Martyn, as well as being a conflict that is confined within the borders of Ukraine, this has got a very international feel to it, and you see a number of countries who are clearly wanting to support the Ukrainians to defend democracy, and that's something that the British government have been lauded for. It's certainly something that should not be dropped, should it?
No, and I mean, democracy is such a precious thing, as we see too clearly that it can be snuffed out. Iran's a clear example of that when you see the way their regime works. So, yeah, it's essential that Ukraine gets support. I think the worrying thing, though, is how do we support Ukraine without the conflict escalating? Have we gone beyond the stage where it's now impossible to solve it without it escalating? It's quite a frightening situation. I don't even pretend to have the answers to that one, but it definitely is something that people should be a lot more concerned about. I think there's almost a news fatigue now with the general public that there's a war in Ukraine, it's getting blamed for prices rising here, and they're just switching off. It's just they've heard it. But the reality is it's happening here and now, and it's a very real danger to us all.
And of course, the sort of spreading of that into drone attacks in Moscow would seem to be a worrying trend, but an understandable one, even if it were Ukrainian forces who were behind it.
I think that's very true. I mean, Ukraine is a relatively small nation fighting what is a massive juggernaut. So if some of their actors have taken on this kind of action, you can understand why they would do that.
Indeed, we go from a small nation fighting a juggernaut to something closer to home, as Holyrood has debated a tax on devolution in the Scottish Parliament. SNP Deputy Leader Keith Brown is set to lead a debate in Holyrood on protecting devolution in the Scottish Parliament this very afternoon. The debate highlighted the UK government's increasing encroachment on the devolved settlement and a recent pattern of attacks against devolution, including the use of an order under Section 35 of the Scotland Act 1998, used to veto devolved legislation. And there are also regular breaches of the Sewell Convention by the UK government. Brown will make the case that the UK government's actions in regards to devolution in Scotland underline the vulnerability of the Scottish Parliament. He will also highlight the growth in support for extending the powers of the Scottish Parliament and the majority support for independence currently seen in opinion polls. He is expected to say that with the limited powers of devolution, the Scottish Parliament has been able to make a difference. The Scottish Government, the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish people need more powers, not fewer. I suppose if you were to turn to any MP and to mount a defence of Westminster and their actions, you would be one of the last that we would seek to so do. And I think that, in a democracy, people have differing views and opinions, but there is a draconian sense here. Is it a sense that they're running out of options in defending the union, or is it just them being big bullies trying to make sure they get away with the nonsense that they have been?
I think there's probably an element of both those points in the equation. It feels like we've reached that point where it's you'll have had your devolution then kind of situation. I've said for a while, the days of devolution are numbered, and I don't say that lightly. We have to make a decision whether we go backwards towards a more direct rule, which is obviously what the Tories want to impose on us, or we go forward and embrace more powers and full independence. The status quo isn't really an option anymore, and that is the reality. So it's getting squeezed, and it's where we go from here. Now, we've seen the most draconian example of that with the use of a Section 35 order, completely unprecedented. We're seeing that with them refusing to sign off on the DRS scheme. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. We know from the UK Internal Markets Act that they now have massive powers to just impose their will on Scotland, and these flexing of their muscles, if they get away with it, they will do that, and they'll do that at every single opportunity. So we have to really take the fight to them, and it's not just about what decisions have been made, and they'll try and pick culture wars and decisions where they can get a wedge in between people. But we've got to look at, this is a democratic parliament elected by our peers in our interests, operating within the powers that it's been given under the UK system, and they're still striking down these items. So this is completely undemocratic, completely unacceptable.
Indeed, and it was Thatcher who once said that if the Scottish people wished independence, all they would have to do was vote for it, and made the claim that would mean a majority of MPs in Westminster. And yet we seem to be well beyond that on a number of occasions. What do you think is going to be needed in order to finally start the negotiations that there will be a border between the two countries?
Well, we're going to have to break the impasse, and we need to do that pretty damn quick, in my opinion. I mean, the pace that things are coming down the line at us tells us we need to move a lot quicker than things have been going. Now, that's where we are. How do we get to that point? We've got a crazy situation that we've got multiple mandates for holding a referendum. The courts have said we can't hold one. The UK will not agree to holding one. So we're in this envious position that we've got democratic mandates but no democratic route. Now that isn't sustainable in any democracy. So, we've reached the point where Britain is well and truly broken. And it's whether people just say, oh, that's fine, it can be broken, we'll just put up with it. Or they say, no, this is not acceptable. And we demand that something changes and something happens. And we're going to have to take that message to people at the next election, whenever it comes, and it'll be coming down the line pretty quickly.
Indeed, and talking of things that are not acceptable, we've certainly seen over the last few years with COP26 coming to Glasgow, a highlighting of environmental issues, and today a ministerial statement with regards to the deposit return scheme came out with Lorna Slater, the Minister for Green Skills, Circular Economy and Biodiversity. There you go. I managed to get through the Ukrainian names but couldn't pronounce green skills properly. She delivered a statement to the Scottish Parliament today on the latest position on the Internal Market Act exclusion for the Deposit Return Scheme, or as it's commonly known, the DRS. The Minister stated that the Scottish Government's request for exemption from the Internal Market Act, which the UK Government put in place following Brexit, had come with the condition that glass recycling be removed from the Deposit Return Scheme. Slater stated that the decision had come as a surprise because the decision to include glass was based upon the UK Government's own manifesto commitment to introduce a DRS with glass and waste and recycling are fully devolved policy areas. She went on to add that this would have a significant impact on the deposit return scheme, which, as designed with glass, would have reduced carbon emissions by an estimated 4 million tonnes over 25 years, and that this estimation would be reduced by over 1 million tonnes if following the UK Government's intervention. The UK Government's decision also risks critically undermining the commercial and economic viability of the DRS, according to her, as glass would make up 1/4 and 1/3 of the volumes recycled, and removing it means severely reducing the scheme's income, as well as the social benefits it provides. Slater stated that if the UK Government had given us the full exclusion that we had sought, then I would be here today setting out all the detailed steps that we are taking ahead of go-live date next March. Finishing her statement with a call to the UK Government asking them to reverse their decision to exclude glass from the scheme. It's not just, I suppose, the fact that the UK Government are flexing whatever muscles they wish to flex. It's the fact that they've passed something which allows them to grab things back in terms of the fallout from Brexit. It's the fact that they are going against, heaven forfend that a UK Government would renege on manifesto promises. But it's also something which, again, in terms of the defence of democracy, seems to be quite absurd.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, these are powers that Scotland has through the devolved settlement. It should not be up for debate. I mean, it's not a union of equals if the Welsh scheme, I understand, it is going to include glass. So, I mean, it's just bonkers. What they're actually doing is picking a fight, and they're deliberately picking a fight with Scotland. So it's not ideological or business related. It is purely they want a bare knuckle battle, and they're trying to pick an issue that has been a bit controversial. You know, there are people who are not happy. There's been businesses who have been concerned about the pace it was coming in, and I think, you know, by delaying the scheme, the government had the chance to sort these issues, but this attempt prevents them from doing that and showing that it's a scheme that would work. It works across other parts of Europe. We just have to get the details right, and when you're bringing something in, you expect a few teething issues at the beginning, and I think that's where we were, and they've jumped at this point while people are a bit divided, trying to pick a fight and trying to divide the Scottish people, and we just need to, whatever our view is on the technical merits of the scheme, say, hi, this is not on. And it's definitely not on if they're going to agree to glass being in the Welsh scheme.
Indeed, and from one square go, we move to another with the COVID inquiry chair extending the deadline for Cabinet Office to hand over Boris Johnson's what WhatsApp messages. The inquiry into how the government handled the COVID pandemic has extended the deadline for the submission of evidence as discussions continue between the inquiry and the Cabinet Office over whether Boris Johnson's 24 notebooks and unredacted WhatsApp messages from during the pandemic will be handed over. A notice released by the Cabinet Office today claimed that they did not have the documents, despite various supporters of Boris Johnson claiming that he had given government-appointed lawyers, paid for by the Cabinet Office, access to the documents. These lawyers are thought to have reviewed the unredacted material before determining that it was unambiguously irrelevant to the investigation. As the positions of both the inquiry and the Cabinet Office remain unchanged, the Cabinet Office is now considering legal action to prevent the unredacted material from reaching the inquiry, as the government believes that the inquiry does not have the right to access the documents. Inquiry Chair Heather Hallett has granted an extension from the previous deadline of 4 o'clock today to 4 p.m. on the 1st of June, as the Cabinet Office has so far refused to relinquish the documents. I often wonder which smart brother it is that's running number 10 this week, but this just, in a serious point, it takes the whole idea of politics and democracy and it reduces it to the point of mudslinging and redacted WhatsApp messages and notebooks and so on. It's unedifying.
Yeah.
But it's also a government that seems to think that it can get away with anything.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's worth pointing out, in case anyone's missed the technical fact, this is twice the deadline's been extended now. It's not just once, it's twice. They clearly don't want to hand over this information. Now, I like to think I'm a reasonable, fair-minded person, and I can see both sides of most arguments. Now, there's the side saying normal circumstances, private discussions between ministers and civil servants would be confidential for a few decades, probably 20, 30 years. And there's the other side where this is not the normal circumstance. This is a public inquiry in the public interest, and the chair obviously feels they should see this information. Now, whether that information should be published until they decide whether it is relevant, but they should see it, in my opinion. So I don't think shouldn't be up for argument. They should be handing this over, at least in the first instance, in confidence to the inquiry, so they can determine whether it is actually relevant. They think it might be. I think the very fact that the government spokespeople are able to say we don't have them, but it's not relevant. Well, they've obviously seen them. They've seen enough to make that assessment, but clearly the chair's not convinced. And I think, given Johnson's track record of basically being an out-and-out charlatan and being untrustworthy at any level, I would be inclined to say I'd like to see them for myself as well if I was chairing that inquiry. So I think on balance, I'm siding with inquiry on this.
Out-and-out charlatan probably is being a little kind in some cases. Down in Westminster, it's the prevailing mood down there that this is an attack upon it as an institution, in terms of, because we've seen the Speaker berate individual members because they have released ministerial statements without actually following the protocol. Is this basically just a government with no buffers?
It's certainly a government with no morals, and there's no compunction on what they're doing is not in the public interest, but purely in their own self-interest. So and I don't say this lightly. I mean, I grew up in Lithgow. I knew people who were Tories, and they were perfectly decent individuals, but with a different economic view of the world. That's not the type of people we're sitting opposite at Westminster now. And I don't know if the average man on the street has twigged to that we're dealing with a force that is almost fascist in its approach when you see what it's doing with migration and just moving further and further to the right. And the saddest thing is, of course, we're seeing Labour playing catch-up and trying to chase the same votes. And I just don't see why they're even doing that. But the whole body politic in the UK is moving to the right. It's getting further and further away from Scottish values. And that's the trend. I don't see that trend changing anytime soon. The best we can do is get away from Westminster and chart our own course, which will be much more in keeping with our own values and our own ethos and our own economy.
I suppose that's one of the interesting things, that the politics works in a cycle, and there is a consensus at some point. 45 to 79 people talked of there being a sort of centre-left consensus, and then Thatcher moved us to more in a sort of centre-right some would suggest even further right than centre. But now it just appears that they have got Keir Starmer in a noose and are sailing off into some strange, the trains will run on time sunset, while the Labour Party, and people talk about, I never left the Labour Party left me.
Yeah.
And we're now seeing this strange, I think was it this week or last week where Keir Starmer talked about immigration.
Yeah.
And it was shame called quite rightly, and we're losing that sense of a moral value. Yeah. Is there a likelihood in Scotland that what we might do is be fooled into propping up a Labour government because there may be a resurgence in Scotland? Is that a danger?
Well, that's certainly a danger. There's two dangers there, I suppose. There's the danger that the voters fall for that line and say, let's get rid of the Tories and think we're picking a government. We can get rid of the Tories through a whole range of views. And if you look at Scottish politics as it stands just now, in most constituencies you have an SNP representative, and in most of the seats that the SNP don't hold, the SNP are the main challengers, and that is the case in every one of the seats the Tories hold. So if you're voting against the Tories, in that case, if you've got a non-Tory MP, vote for the incumbent. And if you've got a Tory MP, vote for the second place candidate. And in most cases, you're voting SNP. And that would be the logical thing to do if you want to stop the Tories and also make sure Scotland is defended. Once we get past that hurdle, of course, then we have the political reality that we are probably going to have to bite the bitter pill and at least, if not prop up a Labour government, at least prevent a Tory government from taking office, who are the far worst extreme. They are, I've witnessed them in the 8 years I've been at Westminster. I've seen them move from the Conservative, an economic right-wing party under Cameron. They've gone through what I'm calling the UKIP stage, and they're now well into the BNP stage. So they really are abhorrent and have to be stopped. But Labour are chasing their coattails in many respects, and while they're not anywhere near as bad as the Tories, that would be the least worst option. But the best option for Scotland is to make sure our voice is well heard and we get more powers and we get to deliver a chance at another independence referendum.
Indeed, and we move from powers within the UK to the lack of the power to stop the current cost of living crisis. As UK food inflation has fallen slightly in May, price increases are slowing down, and I think this is a very important point, because after over a year of increases in food prices, the British Retail Consortium, the BRC, has reported that annual food inflation fell by 0.03% this month, while the overall shop prices have risen to another high. Fresh food inflation, which has risen spectacularly, follows the increase in price of sausages, milk, cheese and eggs falling by 0.6%. The BRC has said that these small decreases are likely an indication that food price inflation has peaked and is now beginning to fall. The Bank of England, along with several other organisations, raised its inflation estimates based on predictions of high food prices through the summer and autumn. It now expects inflation at the end of the year will be over 5% rather than its previous estimate of 3%. The BRC also warned the government that the UK's dependence on food imports from Europe meant that post-border Brexit controls could potentially cause inflation to increase again. Despite the decrease in inflation rates, food prices are likely to remain high for some time, leading to comments from the Scottish Government that the UK Government is not doing enough to lower prices or to help families. And the importance, I think, here is that the rise is slowing down. We're not seeing negative inflation. We're not seeing prices drop. We're just seeing them getting higher, slower.
Yeah.
And it seems that, and we on this programme before, we've talked about, it doesn't seem to have affected the profits of Tesco's and Asda particularly. And we don't see the dividends being passed on to the normal consumer in the way that you might expect. If, it's tough at the top, and perhaps it should be better at the bottom, which is that trickle down, trickle up, whatever it may be, Trussonomics that was suggested at some point. But it's important to remember that this is not a cost of living increase that is going to go away, that looks as though it's going to gallop further. And there we have again that B word, where post it, the new things that are happening, the changes that have been brought in are likely to make it worse. Would there ever be, do you think, the possibility of a political party in the UK promoting the idea of joining Europe because all the other parties made a huge mistake at one point?
There certainly needs to be. I mean, the food inflation, for all its minor reduction in its inflation rate, and it is minor, we're still sitting near peak 45-year highs for food inflation, was 15.4%. And that is a cost level that people can't really skimp on. The only way you skimp on that is eating less or eating less quality. And that just stores up all sorts of other health issues. I mean, malnutrition is on the rise in the UK. So that tells you something. It's been on the rise for a number of years. It's accelerating. So we have serious problems as being part of the UK here, and food inflation is a symptom of that. But we know that a third of food inflation has been caused by Brexit. It's quite directly attributed to that. 30% of our food comes in from Europe, and a third of that food inflation, which equates to about £250 to the typical household. That's a lot of money for folk. So, the easiest and quickest way to address food inflation would be to get back into Europe. That would be a single mechanism that could be done relatively straightforwardly. It's not rocket science. Instead, they'll come up with all sorts of complex schemes and gimmicks that won't address the underlying root of the problem and will still be in a mess. So, yes, the UK parties need to rethink their Brexit stance because it's not consistent.
Aside from the fact that quite clearly the logic that you've put on the table for rejoining the European Union is probably its greatest flaw for some people, this does have implications, health-related implications. The idea that malnutrition is on the rise, that exists in the United Kingdom, that, we're used to the latest Conservative Party MP cutting the ribbon at a food bank and smiling widely at how wonderful it is that we're using charity to feed people. There is a real need to reset and understand food poverty leads to real poverty, which therefore leads to real needs that are not being met by the services that have been starved under austerity. There's a big issue in amongst there.
Yeah, and it's a huge button to press on health, because we know the biggest driver for health inequality is poverty. And we know obesity is one of the big drivers in there as well. So you've got people eating poorer quality stuff, adding to obesity or malnutrition. So a whole host of issues connected with it. And we've just got to crack that on its head and solve the problem. But it's not going to get solved while we're tied, unfortunately, to Westminster.
Indeed, as you said, obesity, I did breathe in. And we move from there on to data breaches in 90 organisations following a cyber attack. We talked earlier about the drone attack in the Ukraine, but here we have data breaches in 90 organisations after a cyber attack on the outsourcing group Capita. Britain's data watchdog has announced that about 90 organisations have reported breaches of personal information held by Capita after the outsourcing group suffered a cyber attack. The company, which runs crucial services for local councils, for the military and for the National Health Service, was the target of a hack in March this year that caused a significant IT outage. Capita's systems are used for it to administer pension funds for several large firms, including Royal Mail and AXA, covering millions of policyholders. The attack prompted the pensions regulator, the TPR, to write to more than 300 pension funds to ask them to check whether data had been stolen by hackers. A second data breach emerged this month when it was reported that the London-based firm had left benefits data files in publicly accessible storage, prompting several councils to say they thought their data had been compromised. The Information Commissioner's Office, the ICO, said that about 90 organisations had so far been in contact with it over the two incidents. In a statement, the ICO has said they are aware of two incidents concerning Capita regarding a cyber attack in March and the use of publicly accessible storage. We are receiving a large number of reports from organisations directly affected by these incidents, and we are currently making inquiries. We are encouraging organisations that use Capita's services to check their own position regarding these incidents and determine if the personal data they hold has been affected. If necessary, consider reporting a data breach to the ICO, and we will use this information to inform our next steps. Capita is also an important government contractor and holds billions of pounds worth of public sector contracts, including London's congestion charge system and disability payment assessment services for the Department for Work and Pensions. The outsourcing firm said that Capita continues to work closely with specialist advisors and forensic experts to investigate the cyber incident, and we have taken extensive steps to recover and secure the data. They have said that it is possible the hack in March could cost them up to £20 million. It's a bit concerning, really. Some of the areas that outsourcing company have access to and the sensitivity of that information is a real worry for individuals up and down the UK.
Well, it certainly isn't it? I mean, data is the new gold. I mean, it is such a precious commodity out there. And there's plenty of less scrupulous people in the world that would pay a small fortune to get their hands on accurate data for data, to impersonation and what have we for mining, and it is of concern. I think it's also of concern for businesses, because if you're running a business, you've got a responsibility for the data that you hold as well. So I would certainly reiterate the ICO's call for firms to look and check whether they think the data that's theirs has been lost in that leak, and make sure that it is reported to protect their own integrity. Because if it comes out later on, it'll be harder to identify whether it's been them themselves that have lost it or if it was part of the Capita breach. So I would definitely be checking that now if I was a business that had contact with Capita. Very, very concerning.
One of the businesses that was mentioned in there, of course, is the National Health Service. And we are seeing increasing numbers of contracts of outsourcing, whether it be to, I would hate to moan again about any kind of contract being given to somebody who's associated with the Conservative Party, but we are seeing an increasing move to outsourcing things on the basis of it's cheaper. But this surely highlights just exactly how dangerous that can be without having some sort of central control. And we're only talking about data breaches here, but in terms of the National Health Service, there are other things that have been outsourced that are far more dangerous to individual welfare.
Yeah, no, it's certainly very concerning. I mean, it was only a few years ago when we had England had the massive health cyber attack, which was, of concern. Any attack is concerning, and certainly there's foreign actors, the Russians, the Iranians are behind a lot of that, as are ordinary tech-savvy criminals, and none of them are the people you want your data being found by and accessed by, because it's a pathway to other crimes, and there's the risk of services being taken over or hijacked. Or can you imagine a terror attack where they change people's medical records or blood groups, and the chaos that would cause in a hospital setting? I don't want to frighten anybody, but that's the kind of things that go through my mind when I hear these attacks. It's just how vulnerable. If it's just data being taken, that's bad enough. But what if the data is amended or tampered with, which could be even more frightening in some respects? So we need to be very, very careful, and we definitely need a lot greater security, and there should be much heavier fines for firms and organisations. And I think the individuals at the top of them should be held criminally accountable when these things happen, and that would certainly create the prompt to make sure the systems were in place and were robust. Indeed,
heaven forfend that any government minister would hold somebody criminally accountable for doing things wrong. However, we go from there into more international news as NATO troops on guard in Kosovo, and a Kosovan town came under attack by Serbian protesters. NATO-led troops in riot gear secured the town hall in the Kosovan town of Zvenkan following clashes between soldiers and protesters, which left 30 soldiers and 50 ethnically Serbian protesters injured. This comes following the protesters' boycott of the election last month in at least 3 northern towns where they are the majority, leading to ethnic Albanians becoming a majority of the local council, despite a turnout of only 3.5%. This was due to the Serbians not standing or voting. Tensions rose during the demonstration as the Serbian protesters tried to force their way into the municipal building, but were repelled by tear gas fired by the Kosovan police. Though they initially attempted to separate protesters from the police, the NATO-led Kosovan force, KFOR, soldiers began later to disperse the Serbians, using the protesters using shields and batons. In response, protesters threw rocks, bottles, and Molotov cocktails at the soldiers. The Serbians in Kosovo have never accepted the Kosovan 2008 Declaration of Independence from Serbia and consider Belgrade their capital more than 2 decades after the Kosovan Albanian uprising against repressive Serbian rule. While ethnic Albanians make up more than 90% of the population in Kosovo, northern Serbians continue to demand a European Union brokered deal be implemented for the creation of an association of autonomous municipalities in the area. Kosovan police described the current situation following the intervention of KFOR as fragile but calm. Martyn, I don't know how much you know about that part of the world. I have been to Kosovo. I was lucky to visit Pristina and the university there a couple of times. It's a strange part of the world, but it is one there where ethnicity can cause a lot of difficulties. And here we have a country ostensibly that has been recognised by some, not by others. But the idea of withholding the vote in the northern towns has led to a very strange set of circumstances.
I don't even know where to begin on this one. I could put it on. I can identify it on a map, and it seems to we've had decades of news about ethnic conflict in that area. You definitely need the wisdom of Solomon to solve this, and you just have to hope that the civic leaders find a peaceful solution to the problem, because if they don't find a peaceful solution, the problem will never end. It will just continue to feed itself, and people will be injured or worse.
It's an interesting place because the United Nations have. I mean, I remember turning up to fly out of Kosovo, and that was the day that the Spanish army had control of the airport. And without casting aspersions on any Iberian method of working, we flew out late. And it was just bizarre because the night before, the Italian army had been in the streets of Pristina, and it was just seeing the various different countries having part of the UN peacekeeping force. And of course, you're right, the Balkans are. You can find it on a map, and perhaps one of the reasons we don't want to go any further is because it keeps giving us issues and problems. It's not a million miles from the Ukraine, but also we've just come through the centenary, many of the centenaries of the First World War, and of course that started way down with the Serbs down there as well. But I suppose one of the things that we have seen in terms of COP26 comes to mind, where a Scottish government has the opportunity to make an international stand, and they did that with putting funding in to help those countries less able to meet the demands of climate change. That small nations can make a massive difference. And I suppose that, going back to what we were talking about earlier on, in terms of the way in which we morally see things, having independence would allow us to make those stands and make some kind of change in the world.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely spot on there. I mean, we would be one of many voices, but our voice would be adding to the calls for sanity and positiveness. So I think, we need to be there expressing our own view in the world stage, just like everyone else is. And our view is perfectly valid. We've got people who have knowledge about every part of the world, so why shouldn't we be directly communicating with the rest of the world, although the UK would like to prevent our own Scottish ministers from speaking to foreign countries. Goodness knows what they're going to do with us at Westminster when we meet with ambassadors and foreign diplomatic corps on a regular basis, but maybe they haven't twigged to that yet.
I would have let the cat out of that, just in case. And we move into international news, stay in international news indeed, with further concern and worry as a report has come out from the United Nations, as officials have warned that the stateless Rohingya could soon become the new Palestinians. UN official Olivier de Schutter has warned that Rohingya refugees are at risk of becoming the new Palestinians because they remain trapped in an ongoing and neglected crisis. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on extreme poverty and human rights stated that around 1 million people are living in terrible conditions in the overcrowded camps in Cox's Bazar, and that they should be given the right to work in their host country of Bangladesh as they remain forced to rely on diminishing international support. The refugees, most of whom fled from genocide at the hands of the Myanmar military, are fenced off and separate from the local community, living in squalid and confined shelters. Over the last 5 years, international attention to the Rohingya refugees has decreased, as according to Deshutta, international donors are becoming increasingly distracted by crises elsewhere. The World Food Programme recently announced that it was forced to cut Rohingya refugees' food allowance to just £6.50 a month per person due to a lack of funding. Deshutta stated that security in the camps is very problematic due to armed drug gangs, and that extreme weather threatens to destroy many of the homes there, as the refugees are banned from building concrete structures and largely live in bamboo and tarpaulin shelters. Though it refuses to allow the refugees to work, the Bangladeshi government has criticised the international community for failing to press the Myanmar junta to let Rohingya return safely to their homeland, and has pointed to the lack of international funding to support refugees it has hosted. Earlier this month, the Rohingya delegation visited Myanmar as part of a long-stalled effort to repatriate people. However, hopes of returning have fallen even further following the Myanmar military coup in 2021. The crisis has fallen below the radar, Deshutta has said, adding that greater international attention was needed. I suppose I go back to what I was saying earlier on. If I was going to turn to somebody from the Westminster Village and look for a defence of anything, it wouldn't be yourself. Talking about refugees and international crises, the UK government would be in a very difficult position to complain or moan about somebody else, given the position that they've taken up. And of course, our connections to Myanmar, as it was previously Burma, and the British sort of imperialist connections there would suggest that we should have some responsibility, and we should be looking to use our influence. But it's a part of the world that is really difficult. And of course, Bangladesh as well, being a former part of the British Empire, there should be some sort of influence. But when you look at the state of the UK government, it's hard to see where you would start.
Yeah, well, you certainly wouldn't have started by cutting your international aid budget, which is exactly what they've done. And I think, fair play to the Bangladeshis, they've hit that one right on the head. There needs to be more international support. It can't be left to another poor neighbouring country to back up and bail these people out. It needs a world solution to a world problem. And yeah, the problem is obviously within Myanmar itself, and that's Solomon's going to be busy. We need his wisdom all over the shop to solve these ones, but I don't see an easy solution to that one. But it definitely is. People are suffering, and I'm reminded of the Gandhi quote. You can't help everyone, but everyone can help someone, and there's definitely more that we could be doing. And I think that's the case around the globe. So all these situations, the Rohingyas being one of them, but not the only one, need additional support. And one way around that is we should be upping the international aid budget, because it doesn't save us money in the long run by cutting it, because we just have more problems to solve and greater world strife that then comes to our own shores. So it's in our interest to try and help these people have a decent quality of life if we can't get a political solution that gets them back into their own country anytime soon. And I don't know, how long this could run, but they've been there for a while now, and I don't see an end in sight. I don't want to be doom and gloom, but that's that's where we seem to be.
Indeed, and it's that lack of morality that those who have benefited of their parents and grandparents being able to flee poverty and injustice and even genocide, then being in a position of power where instead of keeping the ladder where people can grab and be pulled up, that they've pulled it away, and we are now left in circumstances, and we know that those refugee camps in Cali, and we've seen many of them in places like Syria and in the Middle East, that the people are not there through choice.
No.
They are there because it is safer to put their feet on a boat than on the land from which they come. And that is really morally difficult to justify not supporting and not helping. Is there anything that the British government, well, I suppose there's plenty that the British government could do. Is there anything that you think the British government would actually be willing to do?
Well, I mean, obviously, I think the biggie would be up in the international aid to where it should be. But talk is cheap, so if they don't want to do that, they could be using some of that soft political power, and they want trade deals all over the place, so they should be using those arms to try and affect some sort of social change as well. So I think there's more than one strand to policy here. So yes, the people on the ground need more aid and support, but they need a political resolution that gets them out and beyond where they are just now, and that is something that the UK should be doing. And while I think there's an extent where it's trashing its own reputation internationally, the UK still does have a bit of clout with a lot of countries, so we should be using that to maximum effect.
One would almost think that they needed somebody who understood about good diplomacy and good politics. However, moving from there on to the announcement today that the Scottish Government has approved funding to support veterans projects across the whole of Scotland. This is 17 projects across Scotland having been awarded funds totalling £500,000, which are designed to help ex-service personnel access support for physical and mental health, financial, employment and cost of living challenges. The grant awards for 2023-24 are from the Scottish Veterans Fund, which has now provided more than £2.8 million to nearly 220 projects since it was established in 2008. From 2022 to 2023, the fund has been increased to £500,000 annually. Veterans Minister Graham Day announced the funding awards while visiting community veteran support in Glasgow. The organisation has been awarded £18,500 plus for its Warmer, Healthier, Safer Veterans Project, which is providing food, peer support and financial advice to veterans facing challenges as a result of the cost of living crisis. They said that each of the 17 projects awarded funding from the Scottish Veterans Fund this year will make a real difference and will mean our veterans can get the help they need when they need it. I suppose, Martyn, this is something that, you see those in the political right trying to make some kind of capital out of, that, our veterans need this as opposed to other groups. But this is realistic, practical, honest, one almost might say good politics in terms of helping and supporting people who have given, for many of them, a lot of sacrifice for the defence of the realm, their country, whatever it may be, that they have gone out there and have done their bit. So it's welcome news.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great initiative. I think we're probably, as a nation, quite good at looking after servicemen while they're in service, but then when they cease to be, they can be almost forgotten by the service that they were part of. And I think this is very welcome, as are a lot of good community groups working with veterans as well. And veterans, they take up all walks of life and trades, but they have had a lot of issues from when they leave the service. And in many cases, it's not always an easy transition back to civilian life, and depending on where they've served and what they've served in, there can be all sorts of traumas that people are dealing with as well, and they've picked these traumas up on our behalf. So we have a moral responsibility to give as much support as we can.
Indeed, and we're at that point that we're seeing a lot of the documentaries commenting upon Northern Ireland up to in the 1970s and 80s, as well as the Falklands War, and seeing just the effect, the long-term effect of those soldiers who were put in a position, many of them coming from working class communities, many times of high unemployment, looking for some way in order to serve, but also to ensure that they have some kind of income and they've got some kind of career. And it was very attractive and pushed very much at dole queues in order to recruit people in. And it's vitally important that we never forget that.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely correct. And I mean, I know from my own constituency case what we've dealt with a number of people who've been ex-veterans from that generation who were Falklands servees or were in Northern Ireland. And well, they've told me on a personal level some of the events that they've seen or things that have influenced them. That's quite harrowing, and they haven't had enough support on issues, and some of the issues with pensions and things have been quite disappointing, that the UK has not looked after them as well as they should have been. And you're right, for some families, they had a military tradition and that was a sort of career of choice. For others, it was an economic escape from poverty. But, irrespective of the route they went in, it's what happens when they leave. We need to support and make sure that they remain a vital part of our community.
Indeed, and a vital part of our community, of course, is those children and young people who have been supported by the Scottish Government. And finally this evening, we end on some good news, as it was reported that more than 300,000 children are receiving a £25 weekly Scottish Child payment. It's now being received by families of more than 1/3 children and young people, according to statistics which were published today. To be accurate, it's around 303,000 children receiving the payment at the end of March 2023, with the total amount of benefit paid out since the launch of the programme is now standing at a staggering £248.6 million. Now, in November last year, Scottish Child Payment was extended to include all eligible children until their 16th birthday and was increased to £25 a week. Commenting on the statistics, First Minister Humza Yousaf said that he was pleased at the take-up of the payment, but that the government still want to get that money to all of those eligible, adding that the Scottish Child Payment is one of an ambitious range of actions to support families immediately and in the long term. And Polly Jones, head of Scotland at the Trussell Trust, also commented, saying, "We have long called for the Scottish Child Payment to be increased and extended to all children up to 16, and so it's very encouraging to see the positive impact this is making, reaching more families and getting more cash into the pockets of people who need support the most." And I suppose they need the support the most. And we are talking about, we're not handing £25 a week out to children at the school gates. What we're doing is we're supporting families in order to ensure that they have economically got access to money that will allow them to clothe, feed and support the very children who suffer greatest when it comes to poverty.
Yeah, it's been described as game-changing, and it genuinely is. It's not just a glib, soundbite slogan. It really is game-changing. You compare that with the same equivalent families elsewhere in the UK. They're not getting that support. And, it's great that our government's been able to provide that here in Scotland, but at the same time, on the other hand, the UK government removed the uplift on universal credit, which people more... So what we're seeing is the government taking great initiatives to help support people and address poverty, but they're doing it with one hand tied behind their backs without the full fiscal and economic powers. And we really need that to be able to make all decisions for ourselves in real time. And I stress real time because that's such a fundamental part. We need to identify a problem and act on it, not wait until England thinks it has a problem and decides to act on it, and then we get the knock-on effect. So we need that greater flexibility. But this is a perfect example that shows people what we can do. And there's been studies out that show that Scotland is a more equal society, and for those with younger families, it's a much fairer place to live than elsewhere in the United Kingdom.
And I suppose it's that thing of, instead of mitigating the policies of somewhere else, what you have is the opportunity to put in place the policies which support the people around you.
Absolutely, and in a joined up manner, so that they all dovetail together perfectly, not just bits here and bits there. Welcome as those bits are, and this is a brilliant example of a bit that really makes a difference.
Indeed, and with that is all we've got time for this evening. I'll start by pulling everything together by thanking you, Martyn, for being with us tonight. It's been a joy and a pleasure to have you, and indeed to talk through the smorgasbord of topics that we've managed to get through. So thank you very much for being with us.
No, my pleasure.
So that is it for this evening. And before I go, I just want to, as I always do, and my colleagues do as well, to remind you, and don't switch off yet. Stay with me, because it's important. Because many of the topics that we've talked about tonight are very important. They're very important for ordinary people in many media outlets don't quite get the time or the opportunity to talk about them, discuss them, and bring you a unique Scottish perspective. And that is what we're attempting to do at Broadcasting Scotland. But we gratefully depend on the generosity of our supporters. And as always, this is a thank you to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment. And you will see beneath me here where you can sign up and you can contribute to ensuring that we have the opportunity to make programmes that will be from a unique Scottish perspective, and indeed will be from a Scottish perspective. So thank you very much for all of you who have already signed up, and for those of you thinking, please make that thought real. Turn it into a real-time commitment. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming one of our supporters. We have set ourselves a target of adding 10,000 new subscribers to enable us to employ staff here. It's made by volunteers at the moment to make more programmes. Think what we could achieve. So, from tonight, where we were, very soft, very understanding. We only called him an out-and-out charlatan. Others might have been harsher. It's good night from me, and thank you for watching.